When Jesus returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. So many gathered around that there was no longer room for them, not even in front of the door, and he was speaking the word to them. Then some people came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. And when they could not bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him, and having dug through it, they let down the mat on which the paralytic lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now some of the scribes were sitting there questioning in their hearts, "Why does this fellow speak in this way? It's blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" At once Jesus perceived in his spirit that they were discussing these questions among themselves, and he said to them, "Why do you raise such questions in your hearts? Which is easier to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Stand up and take your mat and walk'? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, stand up, take your mat, and go to your home." And he stood up and immediately took the mat and went out before all of them, so that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." Baruch Moabun.
This is the truth. Peace be with you.
Praise and blessings to Jesus Christ, our Lord and God, for giving us his words of life. Praise and blessings to Jesus Christ, our Lord and God.
Father Charbel, Father Peter, dear sisters, dear brothers and sisters, welcome on this very hot night. When I was single, one of my friends said to me, "Why don't you ask Kathy out?" Kathy was the friend of his sister. And I thought, that just sounds like a good idea. So I asked her out. And 34 years later, I'm still married to her. When I was 25, after I left the seminary, I didn't have any real qualifications. I was without a job, didn't have any plans for the future. And a priest friend of mine said to me, "Why don't you do teaching?" 34 years later, I'm still teaching at the same school. 10 years ago, if somebody would have said to me, "You're going to be a deacon," I would have laughed at them. But through the suggestions of a friend at school, even a student, the seed was planted, slowly grew, and in 2019, I was ordained a deacon. Now, the reason I tell you these stories is not so that you can think I'm a bit slow, but it's because I identify with the man in the gospel, the paralytic in the gospel, who was brought to Jesus by his friends. And I have been brought to the good things in my life by the people around me. That's very important to understand. That's the role of the church. And by church, I don't mean the building, I mean you. You are the church. We are meant to help each other, to bring each other to Christ. We can't do it alone. We are meant to encourage each other, believe in each other, suggest things to each other. We need to help each other come to the best version of ourselves. Because often we don't see it within ourselves. We can't see it, or we refuse to see it. I know there's a group of young men in the parish who meet regularly for prayer to help each other overcome some, negative decisions they may have made in the past. That's church right there, helping each other come to Christ for forgiveness and for healing. So never be afraid to suggest things to people, to say to someone, Look, I think you're good at this. Why don't you try this? Or look, you have a gift at this. Why don't you do this? Or maybe, don't do this. This is not good for you. I think you're better off doing something else. Because often that's how God works in our lives. He doesn't usually send us visions, or we don't usually hear voices from heaven. He usually speaks to us through the simple, ordinary things, like other people, like books, like the Gospels, so on and so forth. In my last homily, I told you that if you look at all the stories during the Sundays of Lent, the people who are healed are the people from the unclean group, the people who were considered disliked from God. And there's another thing that's similar to all the people who are healed in these stories, and that is their faith. They were prepared to take a risk. They showed some initiative. They were prepared not to be kept down by what other people thought or what other people believed. Look at the leper. He dared to call out to Jesus and ask to be made clean. And Jesus went over to him and touched him, even though Jesus knew that by touching a leper, he would be made unclean. Look at the hemorrhaging woman. She took the risk and dared to touch the cloak of Jesus, even though she knew that according to Jewish law, that a woman who was losing blood, if she touched someone, he would be made unclean. Look at the prodigal son. He dared to go and return to his father's home, even though he knew he could be punished or that he would be sent to live with the servants. Next week, you're going to hear the story about the blind man who calls out to Jesus to be healed, and everybody around him tells him to shut up, but he doesn't. He keeps calling out, and Jesus goes over to him and heals him. And tonight, those 4 men, they bring their friend to Jesus, and they couldn't get in because there was such a big crowd, so they climbed up on the roof, dug a hole in the roof, and let him down on a stretcher. That's initiative. I always think they're Lebanese because maybe they were tilers. And I definitely know they were Lebanese because although they come late, they still went to the front of the line. I won't tell you what village I think they're from. I might get into trouble. But anyway, that's faith. Faith is always risk-taking. Faith is always an act of courage. And Jesus always responds well to this kind of faith. And so this is teaching us that faith is not just a belief in our head, it's action. It's doing things. It's taking a risk. It's being prepared to look silly in front of others. It's Abraham leaving the comfort zone of his family and of his country and going to another country that God would show, that God promised him. It's Joseph who dared to believe in a dream that told him the baby within the womb of Mary is not from man, it's from God. Talk about a risk. It's Peter stepping out of the comfort zone of his boat and walking on water, even though he knew it's impossible for men to walk on water. And it's the 4 men digging a hole in the roof and letting their friend down in front of Jesus. This is the meaning of faith, brothers and sisters. Faith is always attempting the impossible. It's always attempting what other people think is impossible. Not because you think you can do it or you believe in yourself, but you know that Christ can do it and God can do it in you and through you. When they brought the paralytic to Jesus tonight, Jesus says to the paralytic, "Son," notice he calls him son first, that's very important. "Son, your sins are forgiven." And the religious leaders say to him, "Well, who the hell do you think you are, Jesus? Only God can forgive sins." And maybe his 4 friends even were thinking, "Well, actually, Jesus, we didn't bring him here. We didn't go to all this trouble for you to forgive his sins. We brought him here for you to heal him." But Jesus knew that what really paralyzes us is guilt. What really keeps us on the mat is self-hatred, self-doubt. It's the belief that we are not worthy to be called God's son. And that's why the first thing he said to him was, "Son, your sins are forgiven." You see, the devil, Satan, wants to keep us on the mat. Satan wants to keep us paralyzed. And that's why he's always whispering to us, "You're no good, you're a sinner, you're bad, you're too weak, you can't do it, don't bother." That's the work of Satan. But Christ is always saying to us, yes, you are a sinner, but you're forgiven. Yes, you are a sinner, but you are still precious in the eyes of God. And that's the gospel right there. We are sinners, but we are still precious in the eyes of God. So Christ is always telling us, get up off the mat, get up from the mat of your hatred and your guilt and your doubt, and walk into the future. Walk into the productive future, the fruitful future, the good future where you do good for yourself, for your family, for the church, and for the world.